There's no doubting that Peru was a turning point in my life. I really reimagined myself, and for quite some time I pursued a path of unconsidered hedonism, and it was great. I'm not doubting that for a second, although I thought I'd try and illustrate with at least one story something of the moral dilemma that I found myself in quite quickly. So here goes. Now, I have to start out with a little bit of a precursor. You might recall my friend Yasin from a previous video, the Bulgarian thought leader, shall we say, who was also something of a champion shoelace tire. Well, after staying in the digs, he'd moved on to Italy, where he picked up a contract job. And one day in the post, I received a package which was it looked like a sales manual, how to sell kind of thing, except it was essentially a parody of sales techniques called the CDS technique. It was all about how to be a womanizer. And Yasin had sent it to me as a sort of hint that perhaps it was time for me to start thinking in a more strategic way about how to meet my significant other out there in the world. I remember one of the pieces of advice in the book was, there were actually a bunch, really good stuff, like don't think that you're going to meet interesting women in the places that you usually go, like bars and so on. How about the supermarket? So develop your techniques of chatting people up when you're selecting some veg, and never go to the supermarket looking anything less than your best. And that was one of the more polite sorts of suggestions that the CDS technique gave you. Another was, so you're not having any luck with the ladies. You get only so far, and it never really ends up in bed. Not to put too fine a point to it. Well, their suggestion was, have you tried asking her? And the writer said, well, there's an enormous number of people who go through life thinking they're not getting what they want, but they never actually ask for it or say that it's what they want. And when I found myself in Peru a couple of years later, I thought about this book, and with my newfound confidence. And one evening, things had started to... There'd been an upturn in my success in that department. I thought one night, what happens if you just really put all your sort of veneer of niceness to one side and went out and really played a hard sell? How successful would you be? And actually, how quickly would you accomplish your objective? So I thought, I'm going to try this out. A sort of social experiment with me as the participant and observer, which probably isn't part of the scientific method. But anyway, there we go. Off I went. And in Lima, there's a wonderful place called Pizza Street, or Pizza Alley, something like that. And it was a boulevard full of tawdry pizza restaurants, lots of people hustling you to get something to eat, and a lot of women trying to meet foreigners as a sort of, perhaps not in every case, but in many cases, a sort of lottery tickets that they thought somehow would change their life. Mistakenly, I suspect, in many cases, but not in all. So I walked towards Pizza Street, and then in the distance I saw this really lovely lady wearing an incredibly bright kind of canary yellow dress, and I thought, now that's the girl for me. Wonderful. She was in the distance, and I sort of set off. She was with a friend. The friend was rather bohemian character she was selling poetry, a street artist with poems, and she'd give you a poem and you gave her some change kind of thing. And this young lady was tagging along. And I sort of moved up, played all the tricks in the book. I mean, one of the things was my initial chatting was very much to the friend about poetry, although eye contact was being made. I was doing my very best, and I'd set the clock running. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail, and I don't want to give a wrong impression, but 17 minutes later, I was in my apartment. The friend was still peddling poetry, and Miss Canary Yellow Dress was there. She walked into my apartment, swept everything, and literally swept everything off my desk, and what ensued was a fantastic weekend. And it lasted the weekend, and at the end of it, we'd exchanged phone numbers, and I never saw her again. I might have taken her out to lunch once, but that was about it. Very shabby behaviour on my part. What was shabbier, but now I confess, this was something that I was aware of, and she seemed quite young, and I'd seen her, as she sort of fumbled around in her handbag, I'd seen an ID, and when she'd gone to the bathroom, I checked the ID for age. Now, this is a terrible thing to admit to, you know, invasion of privacy and all of that, but honestly, I didn't want to get caught in that sort of 15 going on 25 scenario, which could have all ended terribly wrong. And I'd known that she'd told me her name was Ruby, but I hadn't caught her surname. When I saw the surname written down, I couldn't suppress a chuckle. Her dad obviously was fond of his tipple, of port, and if you say Coburn, as in the port, but kind of go for a more phonetic version of how Coburn was spelt on her identity document, well, I'll spell it out. I met up with a girl, unbelievably, on my experimental night, whose name was Ruby Cockburn. I mean, what were the chances of that? And I honestly, not a word of a lie, this is all God's own truth. I'm an atheist, so I'm not sure if that holds any water, but that really was her name. And it was a sort of strange spell in my life. I don't know if any of you out there have had a moment where you thought you seemed to be meeting people who are using porn star aliases, because the next girl I went out with had the rather fantastic name of Fanny Laguna. So I was less fortunate there. Never mind. Why am I telling you all of this? It's certainly not out of any sense of pride, because after we'd maybe gone out for a lunch and then I'd never ever seen her again, I told myself a whole string of lies to try and shut up my inner moral compass, which was saying, you know, this is an exceptionally shabby way to treat other people, and you're not really enjoying yourself. I mean, there's short-term pleasure, but actually this is not a life you're enjoying. And on reflection, I probably wasn't. You know, and the lie that I was telling myself was, you know, I hadn't gone into this tawdry episode professing undying love and promising her the world. It was very clear from the get-go that this was a shallow, extended one-night stand. So I wasn't misleading her, but all the same, there was an avoidance of full disclosure, let's put it that way, which is the hallmark of I guess, con artists and charlatans and shallow exploiters the world over. And at the time, it certainly struck me that, you know, this had started out as a very interesting episode in my life. I'd found some confidence, but surely the idea was not to just chalk up notches on your belt and enjoy momentary pleasure, but surely the point of all of this was to share things with people, and that was exactly what I wasn't doing. I was taking things from people, and I certainly, in the long run, didn't feel good about myself. Now comes, I suppose, my point. And my point is this: that I probably had that revelation in a quiet moment of clarity, in amongst the extreme high volume noisiness of expat life in Lima at the time, you know, because we were all having a whale of a time. Lots of us were. You know, I hardly say that this makes me out as some kind of genius Machiavellian Lothario. No, not at all. You know, I was just one of a multitude of foreigners who were enjoying themselves in a sort of pitiful, tawdry, colonial, post-colonial sort of way. Exploitative. It was horrible and wonderful at the same time if you kind of quieted your moral compass. The point is that I knew that at the time, and it took all of 10 years to really work that out of my system. And 10 years almost seems coincidental, like that 10,000 hours sort of Malcolm Gladwell idea. It took me 10 years of learning to not be a complete bastard, and it really shouldn't have. I mean, it's not like learning to play concert level guitar. Just being a nice person shouldn't be that hard, especially when you know that in many situations you were not being a nice person, and I wasn't. But it kind of, years later, I reflected on this when I was doing a talk at my school. I was kind of in the sort of pastoral care role, and I was leading a workshop, and I'd read this very interesting article where a gentleman who worked with addicts had said, a big problem is, for a lot of teachers, that they don't understand that for a lot of people with addictions or huge personal weaknesses or problems, they hear the right thing and they know the right thing, but they might need to hear it or learn the lesson hundreds of times. And the problem is, if you're the person who shares the lesson with that child, numbers 1 to 90, you feel it's all in vain, because no sooner do they say, yes, I hear what you're saying, I've learnt my lesson, and they just do the negative behaviour all over again. And you feel, you sort of want to say, damn that brat, or worse, that beyond redemption in the case of, a disturbed, addicted child. But the truth is, it's just a process that they're going through, and the lucky teacher who gives them the message when they're ready to hear the message, the 100th time, feels like they have them at that moment said just the right thing, that they had some sort of Midas touch in terms of guiding young lost souls. And perhaps that's what was true in my case. Maybe I needed to make these mistakes over and over again until finally I was ready to kind of shed that skin, that role I was playing. And maybe it all happens at just the right time. What would have happened if I'd met my lovely Rita at the beginning of that process, not the end? It's hard to say. Who knows? What I can say is that, reflecting on that period of my life, it was very clear to me that wasn't the good life. That was the self-indulgent life. That was momentary fun for long-term feelings of unease or disquiet or dissatisfaction with yourself. So there we are. I mean, this is one aspect of life, but there are many in what might be the sort of media, rock and roll, glorified good life. There are many other aspects, and in the coming weeks I'm going to move on from this, because I think that's about as much personal disclosure as I'm ready to make, and probably more than you needed to hear. So, if you're thinking, enough of that already, priests, I promise we're moving on. Although there are a litany of stories, the 24-hour visit to Santiago to meet the general's daughter is a cracker. But you're going to have to wait a long time before you hear that one. Anyway, until then, until next week, and a further exploration of the good life, although at the moment it's the misinterpreted good life. Ciao from Brazil.